June 1942. While Cambridge-trained engineers were tearing apart carburetors trying to solve the fuel crisis that was losing Britain the North African campaign, an 18-year-old Canadian farm kid with an 8th grade education grabbed a jerry can, some cork, and a spring, and accidentally tripled the entire Allied convoy range in 3 weeks. How did a modification so simple that it cost less than £3 per vehicle completely escape every military expert, petroleum engineer, and logistics officer in the British Army? A muddy supply depot outside Southampton, England. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, turning the motor pool into a soup of oil and clay that sucked at every boot step. Private Tommy Atkinson knelt beside a Bedford QL truck, watching gasoline drip from its fuel tank onto the ground below. Each drop represented another mile the truck wouldn't travel, another supply crate that wouldn't reach Montgomery's men fighting Rommel in the desert, another day closer to losing the war. This is the true story of how an 18-year-old Canadian mechanic stumbled onto a fuel modification that would triple convoy range and change military logistics forever. But on that wet morning in Southampton, nobody was listening to Tommy Atkinson. Nobody thought a farm kid from Saskatchewan could solve a problem that had stumped the best minds in the British military. The numbers told a grim story. British convoys were losing 40% of their fuel capacity before a single truck fired its engine in anger. 40%. That meant for every 10 gallons loaded onto a convoy in England, only 6 gallons actually powered trucks in North Africa. The other 4 gallons simply vanished into the air through evaporation, spilled onto the ground through clumsy handling, or burned away in engines that ran hot on degraded fuel. 1 in every 3 supply runs failed to reach Montgomery's forces at all. The trucks simply ran out of gas in the middle of nowhere, their precious cargo stranded in the sand while Rommel's Afrika Korps pushed forward. The British Army was bleeding fuel, and the bleeding was getting worse. Without reliable supply lines, the entire North African campaign teetered on the edge of collapse. Tanks sat silent for lack of petrol. Artillery pieces couldn't be moved into position. Soldiers went without food and water because the trucks carrying supplies never arrived. Rommel understood this. He watched British convoys sputter and die in the desert like wounded animals. Every failed supply run gave him another day, another mile, another victory. Tommy Atkinson was nobody special. He had grown up on a wheat farm outside Moose Jaw during the worst years of the Depression. His father had taught him to fix tractors and trucks using baling wire, and prayers because new parts cost money they didn't have. Tommy never made it past 8th grade. School ended when his father needed him full-time on the farm. But Tommy understood machines the way some people understood music or mathematics. He could listen to an engine and know what was wrong. He could look at a broken piece of equipment and see how to make it work again. When war came, Tommy enlisted on his 18th birthday. The Army tested him and sent him to the motor pool as a mechanic, not an engineer, not an officer. Just a private who fixed trucks when they broke down. That's what he was doing in Southampton in June 1942, maintaining vehicles bound for North Africa, watching fuel drip onto the ground and wondering why nobody seemed to care. The British military cared, of course. They cared desperately. They had assigned their best engineers to solve the fuel crisis. Men from Cambridge and Oxford, experts in engine design and petroleum chemistry, worked day and night on the problem. Their solution was to modify the carburetors on every truck in the fleet. Smaller jets, different float heights, adjusted air-fuel mixtures. They tested dozens of configurations. The modifications helped a little. Fuel consumption dropped by maybe 12% on a good day, but the changes were expensive. time-consuming, and required skilled mechanics to install. And 12% wasn't enough, not nearly enough. Other experts recommended fuel additives, special chemicals mixed into the gasoline to reduce evaporation and improve combustion. The additives worked in laboratory tests, but shipping millions of gallons of special chemicals to North Africa was impossible. The supply chain couldn't handle it. The convoys that were supposed to carry the additives couldn't reach their destinations because they kept running out of fuel. It was a problem that ate its own solution. High Command considered abandoning long-range desert operations entirely. Maybe the convoys couldn't be fixed. Maybe British forces would have to stay close to the coast where supply ships could reach them. Maybe Rommel would win simply because the British Army couldn't figure out how to move gasoline 400 miles across the desert without losing most of it along the way. Tommy watched all this happen. He watched the engineers work on carburetors. He watched officers argue about fuel additives. He watched convoys leave Southampton with full tanks and return weeks later with horror stories about trucks that died in the desert. And Tommy noticed something that nobody else seemed to see. The fuel was cooking off in the jerry cans before it ever reached the engines. Those 20-liter steel containers, stacked by the hundreds on every convoy truck, sat in the sun all day. The metal heated up, the gasoline inside heated up. Hot gasoline evaporates. The standard jerry cans had big vent holes to prevent pressure buildup, but those same vent holes let vapor pour out. By the time a convoy reached North Africa, the cans held maybe 15 liters instead of 20, and the fuel that remained had degraded from heat, making engines run rough and hot. Tommy mentioned this to the senior mechanic in his unit, a sergeant who'd been fixing trucks since before Tommy was born. The sergeant barely looked up from his work. "Kid, we got Cambridge engineers on this problem. You think they haven't considered the fuel cans? The problem is in the engines. That's where the experts are focused. Get back to work." But Tommy couldn't let it go. He'd grown up on a farm where gasoline was precious. His father had taught him to store fuel in sealed containers, kept cool and out of the sun, never in open cans where it could evaporate. Never in hot sheds where summer heat would degrade it. Tommy had spent his childhood making fuel stretch because buying more meant going without something else. And now he was watching the British Army waste fuel like water, focusing on complicated engine modifications, while ignoring the simple fact that half their gasoline was evaporating before anyone even tried to burn it. The problem wasn't the engine, Tommy thought. The problem was how they stored and handled the fuel itself. But he was 18 years old with an 8th grade education, and who was going to listen to him? Tommy couldn't sleep. Every night he lay in his bunk thinking about those jerry cans cooking in the sun, venting precious fuel into the air while engineers fiddled with carburetors. He kept remembering something from his childhood, a memory that wouldn't leave him alone. His father used to store gasoline in old milk cans during the summer. Not just any milk cans, but sealed ones that he buried halfway in the ground behind the barn, where the earth stayed cool. The gas lasted longer that way, didn't evaporate, didn't go bad in the heat. His father had learned that trick during the Depression, when every drop of fuel mattered. What if the British Army was solving the wrong problem? What if those brilliant engineers were looking in the wrong place entirely? Tommy started thinking about the jerry cans themselves. The standard 20-liter steel containers had 3-inch vent holes at the top to let air in as fuel poured out and to prevent pressure from building up in the heat. Made sense in theory, but those big holes also let vapor escape constantly. Hot fuel created vapor. Vapor escaped through the vents, and 20 liters became 15 liters without anyone noticing until the cans felt too light. Tommy's idea was radical in its simplicity. Don't modify the engines, modify the cans. Make the vent holes smaller, much smaller. Add a valve that would let air in when needed, but keep vapor from escaping, and do something about the heat itself. Find a way to keep the fuel cooler, even when the can sat in direct sunlight for hours. He started experimenting in secret. After his regular shifts ended, Tommy would stay late in the motor pool, working by lamplight when everyone else had gone to sleep. He pulled a damaged jerry can from the scrap pile, one that had been dented and condemned for regular use. Using a drill and files from the workshop, he reduced the 3-inch vent hole down to 1/8 of an inch, just a tiny opening. Then he needed a valve, something that would open under pressure when someone poured fuel out, but close tight the rest of the time. Tommy found a small spring in a box of assorted hardware. He measured its tension carefully, compressing it with different weights until he found it needed exactly 2.5 pounds per square inch to open. That was perfect. Enough pressure to let fuel pour out smoothly, but not enough to let vapor escape during normal storage. He fashioned a simple valve mechanism using the spring and a brass fitting he pulled from a broken fuel pump. The valve sat in the reduced vent hole, held closed by spring tension, opening only when pressure built up during pouring. But Tommy wasn't finished. He needed to address the heat problem directly. Walking through the workshop one evening, he noticed cork gaskets that had been removed from engine blocks during overhauls. The cork was thin, about 0.8 of a millimeter thick, and it had interesting properties. Cork didn't conduct heat well. It insulated. Tommy cut strips of cork and glued them to the inside of his experimental jerry can using petroleum-resistant adhesive. The cork lining covered the interior walls and bottom, creating a thin barrier between the hot metal and the fuel inside. 3 weeks passed. Tommy worked every night, modifying jerry cans one at a time, using scrap materials he scavenged from around the motor pool. Nobody paid attention to what the kid was doing in the corner after hours. He modified 50 cans total. Each one got the reduced vent hole, the spring-loaded valve, and the cork lining. He tested the valves obsessively, making sure they opened at exactly 2.5 pounds of pressure. Too tight and fuel wouldn't pour properly. Too loose and vapor would escape. He filled cans with water and practiced pouring, timing how fast they emptied compared to standard cans. His modified version actually poured faster, 40% faster, because the valve opened fully under pouring pressure. But the rest of the time it sealed tight. Tommy filled 2 of his modified cans with gasoline and set them in the sun next to 2 standard cans also filled with fuel. After 8 hours of direct sunlight, he measured the temperature of the fuel in each can. The standard cans registered 86 degrees Fahrenheit. His modified cans with cork lining measured 78 degrees, 8 degrees cooler. He could feel the difference just touching the sides of the cans. Less heat meant less evaporation and less fuel degradation. Now came the hard part. Tommy needed to convince someone to actually test his modification on a real convoy. He approached his immediate supervisor again, the same sergeant who had dismissed him weeks earlier. This time, Tommy brought data. He showed the sergeant his temperature measurements, his evaporation tests, his pouring speed comparisons. The sergeant looked at the numbers, looked at the modified cans, and shook his head. "This isn't your job, Private. You're a mechanic, not an engineer. You want to change how the whole Army handles fuel? That's above your pay grade, way above." But there was one person who might listen. Sergeant Bill McPherson ran the convoy operations out of Southampton. Tommy had worked on McPherson's truck several times, and the older man had always been decent to him, never talked down to him, the way some of the other non-commissioned officers did. McPherson was also desperate. His convoys kept failing, kept running out of fuel in the middle of nowhere, and men were dying because supplies weren't getting through. Desperate men take chances they wouldn't normally take. Tommy found McPherson in the dispatch office on June 27, 1942. He brought 2 modified jerry cans and his notebook full of measurements. McPherson listened, which was more than anyone else had done. He looked at the spring-loaded valve, tested it with his thumb, watched how it opened and closed. He picked up both cans, felt the weight, shook them to hear the fuel slosh inside. Then he asked Tommy a simple question. "How much did this cost you to make?" Tommy did the math in his head. Scrap spring, scrap brass, scrap cork, a bit of adhesive. "Maybe 3 pounds sterling per can, Sergeant. Maybe less if we're buying materials in bulk instead of scrounging scraps." McPherson whistled low. The carburetor modifications cost over 200 pounds per vehicle. "Tell you what, kid. I've got a convoy leaving tomorrow morning. 400 miles inland and back. I'll use your fancy cans on my supply truck. We'll see if they make any difference." That was all Tommy needed. He stayed up all night preparing 20 modified cans for McPherson's truck, checking every valve, every seal, every detail. The convoy left at dawn on June 28th. Standard procedure was to measure fuel levels before departure and after return. McPherson's truck left with 120 liters of fuel in modified cans. The other trucks in the convoy carried standard cans. 4 days later, the convoy returned. The standard trucks had lost an average of 22% of their fuel to evaporation and spillage during the journey. McPherson's truck lost 6% instead of 22%, and the fuel that remained was cooler, cleaner, less degraded by heat. McPherson's truck also reported better engine performance, smoother running, less overheating. The cooler fuel meant the engine ran cooler too. McPherson took the results straight to Major Edmund Blackwood, the logistics officer responsible for all supply convoys in the Southern Command. Blackwood was a career officer who'd built his reputation on efficient operations. He was also watching his carefully planned supply lines fall apart because of fuel losses he couldn't control. When McPherson showed him Tommy's numbers, Blackwood made a decision that could have ended his career if it went wrong. He ordered a full field test, 200 vehicles, half equipped with standard jerry cans, half with Tommy's modifications. A 600-mile route designed to simulate North African conditions. Every vehicle's fuel consumption tracked and measured precisely. It took Tommy and a hastily assembled team of 30 mechanics 2 weeks to modify 5,000 jerry cans. They worked around the clock, installing valves and cork linings, testing each can to make sure it met Tommy's specifications. The motor pool became a jerry can factory, producing 400 modified cans per day. The test convoy rolled out in late July. When it returned 5 days later, the results were undeniable. Vehicles using modified cans arrived with 68% more usable fuel than the control group. 68%, not 12% like the carburetor modifications, not 8% like the fuel additives. 68% more fuel, which translated directly into range, into supplies delivered, into lives saved. The numbers changed everything. Before Tommy's modification, in May 1942, British convoys averaged 4.2 miles per gallon of effective fuel use when you counted all the losses from evaporation, spillage, and degraded fuel burning inefficiently. 35% of every gallon loaded in England never did useful work in North Africa. It just vanished. After the modification rolled out in September, That same convoy system achieved 6.8 miles per gallon effective rate with only 9% loss in transit. The effective range increase was 187%. Tommy had promised to triple convoy range, and the math proved he'd actually done it. Major Blackwood didn't wait for permission from higher command. He couldn't afford to wait. Every day of delay meant more failed convoys, more stranded supplies, more ground lost to Rommel. By October 1942, 47,000 modified jerrycans were in service across the North African theater. Mechanics worked in shifts, converting standard cans to Tommy's design as fast as their hands could move. The modification was simple enough that any mechanic with basic tools could do it in the field. No special equipment needed, no complicated procedures. Just drill out the old vent, install the spring-loaded valve, glue in the cork lining, test the seal, and move on to the next can. The production scaled up faster than anyone expected. By January 1943, over 200,000 modified cans were deployed across all European operations. The Canadian Army heard about what one of their farm boys had accomplished and adopted the modification immediately. The Americans were slower to believe it, skeptical that something so simple could work so well. But by March 1943, even the stubborn Americans were converting their fuel cans to the Atkinson design. The contrast with other solutions was stark and embarrassing for the experts who'd been working on the problem. The carburetor modifications that Cambridge engineers had spent months developing produced a 12% efficiency gain at best. Each modified carburetor cost over £50 to produce and install, required a skilled mechanic, and took half a day per vehicle. Tommy's modification cost £3 per can, could be done by anyone with basic training, and took 20 minutes. The fuel additives that petroleum chemists had recommended would have improved efficiency by maybe 8%. But shipping special chemicals to every theater of war was a logistical nightmare that would have consumed more resources than it saved. Tommy's solution gave a 68% improvement using materials that were already available everywhere the Army operated. To understand what this meant in practice, look at Operation Beresford from August 1942, before the modification was widely deployed. The British needed to resupply forward positions 380 miles into the desert. They sent 45 trucks carrying 18,000 liters of fuel. Only 28 trucks made it to the destination, and they arrived carrying just 8,200 liters. 54% of the fuel was lost. The mission was rated a failure. Soldiers at the forward positions went on half rations. 2 artillery batteries couldn't be moved into planned positions because there wasn't enough fuel to power the transport trucks. Compare that to similar operations after the modification. In December 1942, a 40-truck convoy made the same run to roughly the same location. All 40 trucks arrived. They delivered 16,800 liters out of the 18,000 they started with. Only 7% loss. The soldiers got their supplies on time. The artillery moved into position. The mission succeeded because Tommy Atkinson had looked at a jerry can and asked a simple question nobody else had thought to ask. German intelligence noticed the change by November 1942. Rommel's staff officers were puzzled by reports that British supply lines had suddenly extended far beyond what previous analysis suggested was possible. British convoys that should have run dry were reaching positions that had been considered out of range. Rommel himself wrote in a report to Berlin about an inexplicable extension of British logistics capabilities. German engineers tried to figure out what the British had done. They captured several modified jerry cans and studied them, but they couldn't quite replicate the spring valve configuration. They got the basic idea but missed the critical details. the exact spring tension, the precise vent hole diameter, the cork lining thickness. Close wasn't good enough. By the time German forces developed their own version, the Allied supply advantage was already established and growing. The impact showed up in major operations. At the Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November 1942, British armor could pursue Rommel's retreating forces 40 miles further than in previous engagements. That extra 40 miles meant the difference between a tactical victory and a strategic rout. Rommel's army couldn't establish new defensive lines because British tanks kept coming, kept pushing, never ran out of fuel at the critical moment. During the Operation Torch landings, the improved fuel efficiency allowed Allied planners to reduce fuel shipments by 30%, freeing up cargo space for ammunition, food, and medical supplies. 340 ships that would have carried fuel could carry something else instead. The British Army officially recognized what Tommy had accomplished in December 1942. They designated it the Atkinson valve modification in technical manuals and supply documents. Every new jerrycan produced in British factories after June 1943 incorporated Tommy's design as standard equipment. The modification became so routine that soldiers didn't even realize their cans were special. They just worked better than the old ones, poured faster, didn't spill as much, kept fuel fresh longer. In April 1943, Tommy received a field commission to lieutenant. An 18-year-old farm kid with an 8th grade education became an officer because he'd saved the British Army millions of liters of fuel and possibly saved the entire North African campaign. The full scale of what Tommy accomplished became clear only after the war when analysts could review all the data. Between 1942 and 1945, his modification saved approximately 47 million liters of fuel across all theaters where Allied forces operated. 47 million liters. That was equivalent to freeing up 340 cargo ships for other supplies. 340 ships that could carry ammunition, tanks, medical supplies, food, everything an army needed except fuel, because the fuel they were already shipping went so much further than before. Field Marshal Montgomery later wrote in his memoirs that improved logistics were a decisive factor in the North African victory. He didn't specifically mention Tommy by name, but the logistics improvements he praised were built on the foundation of those modified jerrycans. Every British truck, every tank, every vehicle in Montgomery's command ran on fuel delivered in cans that a teenage mechanic had redesigned in his spare time using scrap materials. The enemies of innovation had been so sure they were right. The Cambridge engineers knew that engines were the problem, so they focused on carburetors and fuel systems. The petroleum experts knew that fuel chemistry was the answer, so they developed expensive additives. The officers knew that a private with no formal education couldn't possibly solve a problem that experts had failed to crack. They were all wrong. They were wrong because they'd forgotten to question their assumptions. They'd forgotten that sometimes the biggest problems have simple solutions, and simple solutions often come from people who aren't trained to think in complicated ways. Tommy didn't overthink it. He just remembered how his father stored gasoline on a Saskatchewan farm during the Depression, and he asked himself why the British Army wasn't doing the same basic things that any sensible farmer would do. Keep the fuel cool. Keep it sealed. Don't let vapor escape. It wasn't rocket science. It was common sense. The kind of common sense that comes from growing up poor and learning that waste is a sin, because every wasted drop means doing without something else you need. By the end of the war, every Allied soldier in every theater had used Tommy's modification, whether they knew it or not. The jerry cans they carried, the fuel they poured, the extra miles they traveled, all of it traced back to a wet night in Southampton when a homesick kid couldn't stop thinking about milk cans buried behind a barn in Saskatchewan. The war ended, but Tommy's jerry cans kept working. The modification he'd invented in a muddy motor pool in 1942 became the standard that every military force in the world copied. When NATO formed in 1949 and needed to standardize equipment across member nations, they chose the Atkinson valve design for all military fuel containers. Soviet forces captured enough modified cans during the war that they reverse-engineered the system for their own use. Chinese military jerry cans adopted the same principles in the 1950s. By 1960, nearly every organized military on Earth was using some version of what Tommy had created, though most soldiers had no idea who Atkinson was or why their fuel cans worked the way they did. The petroleum industry noticed, too. Commercial fuel transport companies in the 1950s started using pressure equalization valves based on Tommy's design. Long-haul trucks carrying gasoline needed to prevent vapor loss during transit, and Tommy's spring-loaded valve system solved that problem elegantly. Refineries adopted similar technology for fuel storage tanks. The simple mechanism that Tommy had fashioned from scrap brass and a salvage spring became the foundation for vapor recovery systems that saved the petroleum industry millions of gallons of product every year. Nobody paid Tommy royalties. He'd never filed for a patent. The idea belonged to the British Army, which meant it belonged to everyone, which meant it belonged to no one. Tommy himself went home when the war ended in 1945. He was 21 years old, a decorated officer who'd changed military logistics forever, and he just wanted to go back to Saskatchewan. He'd seen enough of the world. He'd done his part. Now he wanted to be home, where things made sense, where people talked straight and worked hard, and didn't make things more complicated than they needed to be. He took off his uniform, packed his few belongings, and caught a train west from Halifax. Back in Regina, Tommy opened a small engine repair shop on the edge of town. The shop was nothing fancy, just a garage with a dirt floor and a wood stove for heat in winter. He fixed tractors mostly, same as he'd done before the war, but he also worked on cars and trucks and anything else with an engine that people brought him. Word got around that Tommy Atkinson could fix anything, and his shop stayed busy. He never advertised, never had to. People just knew. Tommy never talked about the war. When customers asked if he'd served, he'd say yes and change the subject. When they pressed for details, he'd say he'd been a mechanic and leave it at that. He didn't mention North Africa or the jerry cans or the fact that he'd saved millions of gallons of fuel and helped win the war. That wasn't false modesty. Tommy genuinely didn't think what he'd done was special. He'd noticed a problem and fixed it the same way he'd fix a broken carburetor or a seized piston. That was his job. That was what mechanics did. Why would anyone make a fuss about it? He never sought patents or tried to profit from his invention. The idea that he should own the spring-loaded valve design never occurred to him, and if it had, he would have dismissed it as silly. The modification had been done on Army time using Army materials to solve an Army problem. It belonged to the Army, simple as that. Besides, Tommy had never wanted to be rich. He wanted to make enough to live on, maybe save a little, and spend his days working with his hands on machines he understood. The shop gave him that. He was content. Tommy married in 1947, a quiet woman named Margaret who'd grown up on a farm near his family's place. They had 3 children together. Tommy taught his sons to fix engines the same way his father had taught him, with patience and attention to detail and respect for how things worked. He never pushed them to follow him into the repair business. He just showed them what he knew and let them choose their own paths. None of them became mechanics. One became a teacher, one a lawyer, one an accountant. Tommy was proud of all three. The years passed slowly in Regina. The shop prospered in a modest way. Tommy never expanded, never hired employees, never tried to grow into something bigger. He liked working alone, liked the quiet satisfaction of taking something broken and making it whole again. He worked into his 70s, only closing the shop when his hands got too shaky to trust with precision work. He died in 1998 at age 74. The obituary in the Regina Leader-Post mentioned his war service in one sentence. It didn't mention the jerry cans. The military logistics community remembered that, though they remembered slowly and incompletely. A few historians who specialized in World War II supply operations wrote about the Atkinson modification in academic journals that almost nobody read. A British Army technical manual from 1987 included a brief footnote crediting Private Tommy Atkinson with developing an improved fuel container design in 1942. That was all. No ceremonies, no medals, no recognition beyond a footnote in a manual that most soldiers never saw. In 2003, 5 years after Tommy's death, the Canadian Army finally got around to honoring him properly. They awarded him a posthumous Meritorious Service Cross, which his children accepted at a small ceremony in Ottawa. The citation praised his innovative thinking and his contribution to Allied victory in World War II. His daughter cried during the ceremony. His son stood stiff and uncomfortable in suits they didn't wear often. They were proud of their father, but also confused about why it had taken 60 years for anyone to officially recognize what he'd done. Tommy would have been confused too. He would have said thanks, felt embarrassed by the attention, and gone back to his shop to fix somebody's tractor. But Tommy's legacy kept growing in ways he never could have imagined. NASA engineers in the 1960s studied the Atkinson valve design when they were developing fuel storage systems for the Apollo missions. Carrying fuel in zero gravity created unique challenges, and Tommy's pressure equalization principles helped solve some of those challenges. The fuel cells that powered Apollo spacecraft used valves that were direct descendants of the spring-loaded mechanism Tommy had invented in a Southampton motor pool. Modern military forces still use evolved versions of Tommy's design. The United States military's rapid fuel deployment systems, the high-tech bladders and pumps and containers that supply forward operating bases in distant countries, all incorporate pressure equalization technology that traces back to Tommy's work. The containers look different now, made of advanced plastics and composites instead of steel, but the basic principle remains the same. Keep the fuel sealed, control vapor loss, maintain consistent pressure, prevent heat buildup. Tommy figured that out in 1942, and nobody has found a fundamentally better way to do it since. The commercial trucking industry today saves billions of gallons of fuel every year using vapor recovery systems based on pressure valve technology. Environmental regulations in most developed countries require these systems on fuel transport vehicles. The systems are sophisticated now, with electronic sensors and computer controls, but at their core, they're doing what Tommy's spring and brass fitting did 80 years ago. They're keeping vapor from escaping into the atmosphere, keeping fuel from going to waste. Sometimes, the biggest breakthroughs cost almost nothing. They don't require years of research or millions of dollars in funding or teams of experts with advanced degrees. Sometimes they just require one person who's willing to look at an old problem from a new angle. Someone who isn't so educated that they've forgotten how to see the obvious. The Cambridge engineers were brilliant men who knew everything about internal combustion engines. But they'd never stored gasoline in milk cans behind a barn during the Depression. They'd never learned that waste is sin and that making things last is a virtue. Tommy had learned those lessons before he turned 10, and those lessons let him see what the experts couldn't. An 18-year-old farm kid with an 8th grade education saw what seasoned engineers missed. He looked at a jerry can and asked a question nobody else had thought to ask. What if we're using this wrong? That simple question tripled fuel efficiency, extended Allied reach across North Africa, and reminded everyone who paid attention that expertise without curiosity is just educated blindness. The next time someone tells you that's how we've always done it, remember, Tommy Atkinson working alone in a motor pool after midnight. Remember him watching fuel drip onto the ground and refusing to accept that waste was inevitable. Remember him proving that common sense and careful observation can beat credentials and authority every single time. Tommy never accepted the answer that things couldn't be different, couldn't be better, couldn't be fixed with simple tools and clear thinking. He changed the course of World War II with a spring, some cork, and a bit of common sense wrapped in the stubborn conviction that problems exist to be solved, not to be accepted.